I said we're going to be redundant. Well, we're going to really drill down now on the economy because, as I mentioned, building a resilient economy is fundamental. Having a functional economy is fundamental to community development. But we need to understand what that means. We need to understand when we throw out these terms like resiliency and sustainability that we really know what we're talking about. And we really want to give meaning to those two terms today. And I think we are. You'll be able to walk away with, I know what resiliency means now, or sustainability. So with that, I'm going to introduce Kevin Greiner, who's senior fellow with the Metropolitan Center, and of course one of the authors of the Prosperity Study and many other studies that the Metropolitan Center has done over the past couple of years. You have his bio, but just by background a little bit, Kevin has worked both in the public sector. He's a former, like me, I used to be a planning and development director a long time ago before I got into academia. Kevin was the planning and development director for the city of Buffalo, New York some years ago, and then he has also worked in the private sector with IBI. So he's been a wonderful researcher with the Metropolitan Center, providing incredible value added to everything that we do. So with that, I'll invite Kevin to really drill down on the economy. Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Ned, and thank you, Tom, for your generous donation to the center. Thank you also for teeing up my remarks. You're absolutely fundamentally right. The theme of today's gathering is looking into the next 20 years of Miami's future. It's critical now at this junction. The argument that I'm going to make above all else today is that planning is not only critical, but there is, in looking at making Miami more resilient and looking at its future, it's critical that we both learn from history and that we learn from mythology. And I'm going to demonstrate how we do both. The theme of my presentation today, the shape of things to come, is taken from an H.G. Wells, one of his last novels. This was he actually wrote a screenplay that was then made into the movie Things to Come, 1936 science fiction classic that I'm going to show you today, beyond a shadow of doubt, has absolute truth and messages for where Miami is right now. Things to Come came out in 1936. It was absolutely visionary. It peered 100 years into the future. It was actually the story of how the planet went through 2 successive world wars that decimated society, reducing it into a collection of medieval warlord states. However, an intrepid group of engineers, philosophers, scientists, calling themselves wings over the world, continued to develop technology and ended up restoring society by delivering democracy, innovation, new technology across the world. The movie foresaw and predicted the development of television, helicopters, jet airplanes, stealth airplanes, and also major new urban development in entirely new forms. But the real message to take away is one of optimism, that in the face of overwhelming odds, in the face of great disaster, by determination, intelligence, and reason, humans can overcome just about any challenge. And that's really the underlying theme. To say that climate change is the most difficult challenge humans have ever faced, I think, is redundant. 3 numbers that keep me up at night. The first is 90 trillion. Why is that significant? $90 trillion is the best estimate of the cost of infrastructure required to protect the world's coastal cities. This money needs to be spent over the next 15 years. Why is that significant in this estimate? It's also the equal in value to the total amount of infrastructure that's currently on the planet. So basically, our best estimate of what needs to be spent financially is we need to spend what's equal to already here in terms of the world's infrastructure over the next 15 years just to protect against climate change. Second number that keeps me up is minus 13%. The UN has estimated that by 2050, major grain production of 4 crops, the world's leading 4 crops, will drop by 13% because of climate change. At the same time, we're going to be adding close to 1 billion new people. I can't imagine how we're going to manage that. This is going to take some real clever thinking. The third number is 1 billion. The UN also estimates that by 2050, 1 billion people will be displaced by climate change. They'll become climate change refugees. The best estimate of South Florida is that there's no change to anything that happens in South Florida, and sea level rise proceeds as it has been. 2.2 million people will be displaced from South Florida alone. Right now, the global supply of refugees from all causes is about 65 million. That's a little more than the population of France. Getting to 1 billion refugees, I also can't imagine. I'm having difficulty imagining how you manage that. So this is a very, very serious problem if you haven't been convinced of that before. Looking at the local impacts, what this means for Miami-Dade, the recession, some people saying that was kind of a preview of what might happen with sea level rise. I'm not saying it's not even a warm-up. What really happened in the recession was that when you look inside the numbers, most of the real heavy employment losses and job losses were confined, actually, to real estate, construction, and then retail spending. At the same time, you lost 105,000 jobs, but at the same time, during the worst part of the recession, 2007 to 2010, you gained back 48,000 jobs, mainly through healthcare, public spending and education, and actually the tourism sector was actually adding jobs, a testament to its ability to market to international markets. So actually segments of the economy continued to move along. We're looking at a very different picture relative to climate change. You've all seen the 1 foot and 2 foot sea level rise projections. 2045 is about the best target for 1 foot rise. At that point, parts of Miami-Dade are inundated for good chunks of the year. You have about 80 days increasing more than 80 days of tidal flooding in the lowest parts of Miami. That's the long-term forecast, though. That's 2045, 2050. And that focuses also, the amount of risk assessment done focuses on real estate value and asset value that gets either challenged or wiped out by sea level rise. That's also only the tip of the iceberg. It's not just about the value of the buildings that are going to be challenged by sea level rise and face daily flooding. It's the economic activity happening within them that's going to be the real challenge to Miami's future. And so on that basis, really, sea level rise is happening already today. We're feeling the effects. It's not a 2045, it's not a 2060 issue. By 2030 alone, you're talking about 80 tidal flooding days. That's 2.5 months where parts of Miami Beach and the low-lying areas are going to be flooded for that much of the year. That's a significant shock to the economy. It goes up from there. But it's also not a 2030 issue. Right now, our panel later is going to talk about details of the risk, but just very quickly, we're suffering now shocks to the Miami economy, increasing on an annual basis. So the increased number and intensity of hurricanes, the increased costs of damage from hurricanes is going up almost exponentially every year. The ability to insure against those losses is dropping almost exponentially. So that insurance is covering less and less and less of damage. Damage costs are now being put on property owners and business owners increasingly as the cost of damage goes up. Intense rain is now already shortening crop cycles. It's affecting land values. Labor productivity is being affected and will get worse, especially if you have hotter days and you have a lot of industries that depend on working outside, as we do. Overall labor productivity will drop as well. It's already starting to drop. Other disruptions to the system that we're seeing already is a possible loss of investor confidence. As Ned mentioned, we're an economy that's especially dependent on outside investors. At what point do investors in condos, in businesses, really the money that makes Miami move, at what point do they start to lose confidence due to these increasing shocks to the system brought on by climate change? We're already seeing bond ratings being affected by climate change. Moody's has announced that they're actually going to start incorporating municipal local responses to climate change into their bond rating analysis. So the ability to finance and start to invest against climate change will be affected on the negative side by bond ratings. Rising insurance costs to property owners, and then the potential that we may have an insurance provider retreat from the market. At some point, insurance providers may decide that this is just too high a risk and they can't insure it anymore. So we're looking at shocks that are happening today, increasing in frequency. So this is an issue that's right now, and it's building right now. It's not something we put off to the next generation. It's not a 2030, 2045. On top of it all, we're seeing increasing fluctuation in the world financial market. So a increasing number of either banking or recessions each year in more countries every year as a nice kind of frosting on the top of everything. The last issue to consider here in Miami-Dade is the limits to infrastructure. Unlike New York, Tokyo, Amsterdam, Venice and Venice have been, you can argue, they've been managing climate change, they've been managing significant sea level issues for about 300 years. Other regions, because of their geography, will be able in some degree or in large degree to engineer their way out of this process. The Dutch especially have shown how that's done. Miami-Dade, we're going to be very limited on our engineering solutions because of the porous rock that we live in. We can't build seawalls, dams. We can't do the kinds of solutions that other communities will be able to use. So that we're going to have to deal with the reality that the water's coming, it's coming from beneath our feet, and we're going to be dealing with it. What it means is our solutions and our approach to climate change are going to have to be significantly different. They're going to revolve around land use. They're going to revolve around legal policy, economic development policy, and as I'm going to argue today, a very different approach to how we guide this economy going forward. A good offense is going to be our best defense. And the biggest part of that is going to be building a resilient economy. The issue for us, and I'm going to give you a preview of early research that we're doing, trying to develop a different definition of resilience and looking both backward and forward at what really makes a resilient community. The issue now is that resilience is kind of limited to physical infrastructure, building design on one hand, which is critically important. But given what I'm talking about in terms of economic stresses, the frequency, intensity, and right now character of these economic stresses, that's not enough. It's too short a definition. Current economic definitions also focus on the ability of a region to rebound, but is that resilience? Debatable. All the way at the other extreme, very well-intentioned planning efforts using an incredibly broad definition of resilience that includes almost everything under the sun are so big that it's hard to get your arms around. I do this for a living, and I can't understand some of the definitions or grapple with them. They're so big and so broad, much less make workable policy out of them. So our definition is focusing on something much more focused, recognizing the challenges we face that they are right now. We're building a definition of resilience and then trying to define what a resilient community is on this definition. It's the ability of a region to regain employment and improve its economy by restructuring it to avoid or capitalize on increasing climate disruptions that may result in permanent declines in traditional industries. And that's important. So it's a process of both steering clear of the rocks, reacting to change, but taking a forward look to avoid what we know is coming, and making an effort to significantly restructure our regional economy to deal with the future that we can see. There are lessons to learn, as I said, from history. And one of the deepest lessons we can learn about resilience is communities that haven't been resilient, and that's the bulk of the American Rust Belt. This is a personal issue for me. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, I later became director of planning for the city of Buffalo, where for 8 years I fought a daily battle against the death spiral of decline, and I'll talk about the depth of that decline. But once a community gets into a deep spiral of decline, it is really difficult to get out of it. And as Alan has done a lot of research on, there are communities starting to show some signs of life, including my former hometown of Buffalo. But it's been a massively long struggle. You're talking about 60 years of continuous decline, population loss, industry loss. Very difficult to overcome, but we have valuable lessons to learn from it. The other lesson from history are communities that actually have shown a great deal of resiliency, and there are a number. Every single economy, every single regional economy in the country goes through some type of massive stress at some point in its life. How they deal with it is the definition, and how they succeed to get past it, how they change, evolve, and actually become a bigger, better, stronger economy is the essence of what resilience is. And so we learn from those communities that have been especially resilient as well as guideposts for Miami's future. So based on that, we're in the early stages of developing a new type of rethinking resilience and developing a performance index that not only just benchmarks communities against each other, but more importantly, provides a policy roadmap. It really gives us suggestions on how to react, how to move, and which directions to go. It's basically 9 topic areas. I won't bore you with, it's about 22, and it's moving up to about 25 indicators that we use. But the basic issues, and this is some of the interesting correlations that we're finding at the broad level on our early research. We first look at risk level. And understanding, when I say that the shocks are now and that climate change effects are now, very small changes, very small losses in the regional economy can have really big effects. We've actually looked at just 3 clusters: tourism, agriculture, and transshipment. 3 of the most important industry clusters in Miami, and also possibly some of the most sensitive to climate change. This by no means is an overall assessment of what climate risk is, but just looking at these 3 clusters. We ran a model, and this is a standard used model across the country, looking at 5% and 15% reduction in revenue. And the numbers are telling. It's between $2 and $6 billion loss in economic activity every single year. That's actually, in terms of the rest of the county, in terms of the jobs lost, 11 to 35,000 jobs lost, and this is just in 1 year. That's between 1 and 3% of the total economy. These numbers are actually conservative. Remember that during the recession, from the peak to the trough, 2006 to 2009, in 3 years alone, the county lost 34% of all taxable sales. In one 8-month stretch in 2006, total taxable sales dropped by 10%. So these are actually conservative numbers, but you see the relative impact. On a lesson where small ripples can create huge effects. In our model, we look at every single industry, we look at its growth potential, we look at what it needs to evolve, but we also look at its risks, and that's a fundamental starting point for us. Industry structure is also critical to resilience. Overconcentration in industries is kind of a 101 notion of economic development, but it's absolutely true. We're discovering kind of a 5% rule, that the most resilient communities have industries that don't reach more than 5% of their total economy. And that's even in our most advanced economies across the United States. They also don't overconcentrate individually and reach averages that are too much greater than the national average in any single industry as well, so they're well diversified on top of it. The other thing to take away from it is that, and this is critical, absolutely critical, future industrial growth is built on the foundation of your current industry pattern. It's almost impossible to just out of whole cloth create new industries, new economic activity where none existed before in your region. What you see in highly resilient regions is they may lose jobs, but they don't necessarily toss out entire sectors. Older sectors, even older manufacturing sectors in resilient communities, learn to adapt. Maybe it's advanced digital technology, but the talent, the knowledge, the skills, and the infrastructure they've built over decades sometimes gets applied into rebuilding that new economy, and that's something to keep absolutely in mind. And you see that time and time again in resilient communities. Resilient communities also have a much higher content of knowledge embedded in their industries. This is measured by patents, by the educational requirements of the occupations that make them up, R&D spending. But really what the bottom line there is that this higher embedded knowledge provides flexibility. This is how companies and entire regions are more nimble and resilient to change, to major change that way. We also look at productivity. This is labor productivity across the United States. It's a very simple, effective, maybe gross measure, but it shows you the quality of jobs. It shows you actually, it's kind of a hint to the knowledge embedded in the jobs that are in a community. We also look at STEM employment as a key indicator. And one of our favorites, developed by Ellen's colleagues at the Brookings Institute, is the advanced industry employment. Brookings, I think starting in 2012 or so, developed the idea, well, proved the idea that there are 50 core industries that have higher rates of R&D spending, higher pay, higher knowledge content, higher rates of patent activity, and these 50 key industries across services, manufacturing, and energy are actually driving the American economy. They had the fastest rates of growth. Latest numbers are about, in terms of jobs, the advanced industries represent 9% of the economy employment-wise, but about 27% of productivity. So these are the industries, and it's a great indicator we use a lot in assessing the character of a community, and especially in this resilience index, how resilient is it to future shocks? We're finding, interesting enough, that upward economic mobility is also a key piece of resilience. The ability of people to move up within where they live is a key element of overall prosperity. It's also a key element in how a community, how an economy reacts to change. And one of the simple dynamics of that is that low-income jobs, low-skill jobs tend to be thrown off first in a recession or other shocks. People with higher wages and higher income tend not only to be able to gain more or add more flexibility to the places they work, but they have more personal flexibility and to be able to shift jobs. That doesn't happen. So the ability to move up and your ability to move up into higher earning pay is actually a key piece of and it's separating resilient economies from those that aren't. The quality of your labor force obviously is very important. Educational attainment varies extremely and very widely across the United States. And where it shows up highest is usually in communities that have higher levels of resilience, the ability to restructure, the ability to take on entirely new directions, not just add jobs in the same old sectors and same old occupations. One of the numbers that we've developed and we think is telling, we're calling it the 75-50 ratio. And this is the rate at which an economy creates jobs that pay $75,000 or greater versus $50,000 or less. Rather arbitrary, but as it turns out, the number is very telling because it sorts out higher paying, more effective, and it's tied to resiliency. What's also really interesting is it correlates to upward economic mobility through the simple dynamic that if you're creating more higher paying jobs than lower paying jobs, people have more opportunity to move up into higher pay. So it correlates to across our index into other areas as well. We also look very closely at income inequality. Income inequality, for the same reason that economic mobility is very important, is that areas that have high rates of economic inequality seem to be less flexible, less resilient. Those that have less income inequality. One of the most interesting, we also look at housing affordability, but one of the most interesting correlations we found as far as income inequality, there's been a lot of research and a lot of talk about how kind of the tech sectors, the leading tech regions of the country, have become so highly unequal. We're not really finding that. In fact, you've got to look a little more finer than that. The leading tech economies, a number of them, including Santa Clara County in Silicon Valley, has a 95-20 ratio. That's the ratio of people earning at the top 5% versus the bottom 20%. Simple ratio. But their 95-20 ratio is lower than the national average. It's lower than a lot of places. And what seems to be happening, and we're still early, isn't a final conclusion yet, but it sorts out by the types of industries. Inequality seems to sort out by the type of industries that you have. Highly unequal economies tend to be either service-based, tourism-based economies, which are creating a higher percentage of lower-paying jobs. Also, those that tend to be dominated by finance and banking are very much more unequal because they're creating so many more higher-paying jobs, and we're thinking that financial jobs aren't supporting the creation of lower-paying jobs that other industries do at a greater rate. So the communities that turn out to be most unequal are those that are really good at producing goods, services, because they seem to create a wider range and a healthier range of income-paying jobs. The ability to create and grow companies, national brands, is also a critical feature in resilience. Regions that have the ability to do this are successful. We look at Fortune 500 companies, but it really goes much further than that. It's startup capacity. Even more importantly, it's not the number of startups that you create, it's how many of them survive. That's what really drives growth. And we've seen a lot of that here in Miami at both ends. Scale-up rates are also very critical. It's not just the ability to create large numbers of startups, but do they grow into something significant? So we look at the number of companies that grow to $500 million per year over 10 years. How is your community doing on that basis as a real key measure of resilience? Reusing land use is a clear obstacle, and Alan has written actually some very interesting articles on this. I live this as well. A city like Buffalo, which was a dominant economic center in the world, 60% of Buffalo's land area was devoted at one time in its history to either manufacturing, rail, or shipping. So virtually every time you put a shovel in the ground, you're coming back up with contaminated soil. You also have buildings and infrastructure that's absolutely not adaptable to any other types of use. You're talking steel plants that weren't thousands of square feet, they were thousands of acres with rail connections and then all of the dumping that they did. So the quality of land, your kind of previous history defines how much barriers you have to reusing land. Miami has a different problem. We don't have a brownfield problem, but in terms of land reuse, our problem is in the future going to be rising water, salinization, but also the fact that we're squeezed between the ocean and the Everglades puts a real crimp on development that places in Texas and other places don't have that seem to forever expand into the suburbs. So that's another key piece of our index. The last element we're broadly calling redevelopment capacity. And this is a little bit about the speed at which you recover. And Miami has demonstrated really good speed at its employment recovery. We dropped through the bottom, and growth since 2010 has been at or over 20% since then. We've added, as Ned mentioned, we're at record high in terms of the number of jobs. More importantly, and this is the only sort of qualitative aspect of our index, transformative investments, major investments, and they might be in infrastructure, they might be in education, they might be a leading entrepreneur pioneering a new type of business, but investments that are scalable, large, and have an impact that then drive an economy for years is another piece of resilience. And you see that time and time again. We've seen it in Miami. Flagler's Railroad, the construction of South Beach, which after all is completely man-made. Major transformative investments. And transformative investments, unfortunately, and I hope we don't offend anyone, but they aren't football stadiums, and they're not really museums unless they're connected to something bigger. But they're really, it turns out also, some of our early work shows that the most effective transformative investments are typically privately led and privately financed. That's just an element of history. So where's Miami rank in all of this? Loosely, of our 9 topic areas, Miami ranks either at or near the bottom in each of these. The three areas where it ranks in the middle and the top, and I'll start from the bottom, is its land use repurposing. It is constrained, but we still have available land. And what really factors into that is the talent of the development community here that seems to be able to build on it, build anything, anywhere, anytime, and do it really fast. We're one of the best development construction communities on the planet. In terms of growing national scale companies and the ability to create national brands, somewhere in the middle, because, and really it's a balance, we're now the #1 startup capital in North America, but we're also at the bottom in terms of survival, so it kind of washes out some of those gains. We're also, and this is what the community is also echoed, is that we're having trouble growing these small startups, keeping and growing small startups that grow into really large-scale national players. That's been an issue, one to look at. And in terms of redevelopment capacity, Miami is one of the most interesting places in the world. When Miami wants to do something, it does it, for better or for worse. But the ability to get major investments in place and get them done is a hallmark of this place. It's like no place I've ever seen except maybe Beijing. But that's a completely different circumstance, and I don't think we want to trade places with them. So resiliency is a three-part challenge. It's not. You would think, given the challenges, tourism is going to be challenged under climate change, agriculture, transshipment. A number of industries are going to really be challenged to survive. But it's not a matter of just tossing them aside. What it is three parts. Aiding these key industries, and we know what they are here in Miami, to become more resilient. How do they become more innovative? How do they change? The question isn't, well, how do we lose tourism? How do we start to move away from tourism? The question is, what does tourism look like in a post-sea level rise economy? What is that different tourism as strong, maybe even better, maybe even more interesting? But how do we adapt? Tourism is just one example. How do we adapt our existing strengths? Remember, we build on our existing industries. We build on their strengths. How do they adapt and evolve against the future? Seattle might be a great demonstration of this. Seattle has gone through, it was a timber capital, it was a rail capital, it was fishing and canning. In fact, we lived in Seattle before Buffalo. We moved, and Seattle was actually going through vicious cycles in defense spending, so Boeing was fluctuating like this. But it was also still a canning capital, which was starting to wane. Lo and behold, Seattle's maybe one of the best poster children for its existing old school industries becoming something new. Boeing moved its headquarters out of Seattle. It still employs 60,000 people in Seattle. It kept all of its high-end manufacturing. Maybe the most valuable part of Boeing stayed in Seattle. The same with Weyerhaeuser. Weyerhaeuser grew with the timber industry. Weyerhaeuser is still a global player and employs 80,000 people in Seattle, even though it's not supposed to be a timber capital. And on top of that, you've had other small companies like Microsoft and Amazon grow along the way. But they were built out of the previous skills, savvy, and industries of the past in a place like Seattle. Absolutely key to understand. Growing smaller and newer industries, this is kind of our, either the tech or leading edge sector, but ensuring that they're resistant to future climate change or current climate change risks. And growing industries and occupations that improve our overall resistance. Remember I said that knowledge content, the knowledge content of the labor force, really focusing on building those aspects. If you're not a very resilient company, but really targeting on those industries that will make you more resilient and those factors that will make you more resilient over time. And I think I've done it's those 9 areas I've had are the real keys to that. Focusing on those and industries that meet those standards is crucial. What's the scale of change that needs to happen? And these are really gross numbers, but kind of an initial blush at how much needs to happen. If we're going to reach the national average in the advanced industries, we need to grow our advanced industry complement by about 7 to 8%. Current annual growth is only 4.5. If you want to reach a level of where Seattle's at, we've got to grow our advanced industries by 13%. That's between 165,000 to 340,000 new jobs that need to be created in industries and occupations that make us more resilient. Where's Miami go from here? I think we begin, and this is another lesson, important lesson from history, Miami needs to understand where it's at. And I'm going to argue it's at a very similar place to where Buffalo was in 1959. Part of what made Buffalo great was it's the last stop on the Great Lakes. Commodities, goods, grain, processed foods, and later coal and iron ore could not go any further than Buffalo. So they had to stop in Buffalo and unload and then go overland to New York and New Jersey, the big consumer markets. Buffalo, by 1920, became the most potent regional economy, manufacturing economy on the planet by value added. And it continued in that status through World War II. In 1959, that all changed. The Canadian government opened up the Welland Canal, connecting what it called the St. Lawrence Seaway, in effect allowing every ship coming out of, if it wanted to, out of the Midwest to bypass Buffalo completely and sail directly the Atlantic and then to New York and New Jersey. Buffalo at this moment in 1959 was looking at one of the major weapons of its demise. Unfortunately, the leading commentary of its business leaders were like this. They thought the St. Lawrence Seaway was going to actually triple the rate of tonnage at the Port of Buffalo. Didn't happen. Later, cheaper steel from Asia and then Brazil, globalization. From 1959, by 1980, Buffalo's economy was about 60% of what it was previously, and it lost half of its population. Hasn't recovered since. Is Miami at that same moment? I'm not arguing that Miami is anything like Buffalo and looking at that kind of change, but are we looking at a future? Buffalo had no way to understand what was coming at it. I think we do. I think we're much better informed. I think we have a much clearer picture of the future that's coming at us. So are we at a stage where this is a real crossroads? And so what do you do about it? Very quickly. Again, our research is early, but these are kind of 7 early action items that I think could take place without much further study and start to drive us down the path to better resiliency. One is rethinking our redevelopment targets. It's probably time to look again at the one community, one goal targets, this time through the lens not only of economic prospects under the old economy, but looking at resiliency and how do we make them more resilient and grow them that much faster. Focus on our local businesses. Too much attention is given to kind of attracting large employers from outside the area. We need to focus on local businesses because that's the best, lowest risk, most effective, fastest way to grow your economy is focus on the businesses that are here. And we need to restore our small business incentives which have been wiped out. Third, and this is huge, if we are successful in dealing with climate change and sea level rise, Miami's going to build considerable expertise, monetize that expertise, and sell it to the world. The Dutch now are exporting, just on a consulting basis, about $10 billion a year in terms of consulting services because of their expertise. This is a significant opportunity for Miami as well. Guess what? The Dutch solutions won't work here for the most part, so we're not going to compete with the Dutch. We'll be a world leader in a different set of strategies. We need to expand from the bottom as well as the top. It's not just about creating jobs, but it's about empowering our workforce and folks at the bottom to take those jobs. So massive investment in training and education. We've already suggested programs. We'd like to see them go much further. Fifth idea, infrastructure spending is going to happen. It's already happening in Miami. I'm suggesting creation of what's called a Climate Change Works Progress Administration. In the Depression, the WPA not only created jobs, it built infrastructure, but it gave people careers built on those skills. The same thing needs to be applied here. It's actually an approach that's endorsed by the UN, and not coincidentally, the Department of Energy has fashioned its entire marketing program for its new energy loans around the old WPA posters. So this is a potent concept. Let's make sure that money that is spent on infrastructure, and it's about $1.5 billion projected right now, is spent locally, and it's spent also developing companies and people locally. Build our economy that way. This is a big one. Right now, we've signed on to the green print. The county's goal for climate change resilience and carbon resilience is to get to 80% reduction in carbon by 2050. Probably too little, too late. We need bold leadership and a really bold statement to get to a zero carbon county in a much shorter time frame, almost like a man on the moon statement. The benefits of that, it's not just a political statement, it's not just the right thing to do, because getting to zero carbon is the ultimate solution for climate change. It's a huge economic opportunity, and it's been demonstrated by the OECD, by Michael Bloomberg, by the Solutions Project, which actually laid out a plan for the entire state and showed the creation of 90,000 jobs, 200,000 construction jobs. Maybe this is Miami's next transformative investment. Last is building our institutional infrastructure. If this is the most important issue that's facing us, right now the money is starting to be spent and the money is being raised but the institution and organization to deal with this problem is woefully insufficient. We have 3 climate resilience officers spread across the country doing heroic work with tiny budgets and tiny staffs. This needs the focus, large focus of our leading institutions, including our universities. In closing, we have one last lesson to learn from things to come. In another visionary statement, H.G. Wells actually wrote the Man in the Moon speech 25 years before John Kennedy delivered it to Congress and had famous State of the Union address. The lead character, Raymond Massey, who had become the leader of the new community, extolled his residents that the stars were the next step in their evolution, that it was key to their development. It's basically his Man in the Moon speech. I wonder, and I'll finish with a question, is this Miami's crossroads moment? Is this Miami's Man in the Moon moment? And if it is, who among you out there today will step up to lead on this issue? Thank you.